Welcome to another episode of Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, where certified financial planner Lauren Sherman shares thoughts on having a healthy mind, body, and spirit, an abundance of wealth inside portfolios and out, and lessons learned from clients and mentors over the years.
Welcome in to another Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast. Of course, I'm your host, Lauren Sherman, and today I have a very special guest joining the show, Dr. Wade Pfau. Wade is the founder of Retirement Researcher, which is an educational resource for individuals and financial advisors on topics that are related to retirement income planning. He is a co-founder of the Retirement Income Style Awareness Tool. So that's a lot of what we'll be talking about today. So anytime we mention RISA, that stands for Retirement Income Style Awareness. Wade is also the co-host of his own show, Retire with Style podcast. We will go ahead and link that in the show notes as well, so you can check that one out. We were just talking before I hit record that he and Alex have a ton of fun, so I definitely recommend that podcast. Wade holds a doctorate in economics from Princeton University. He's published more than 60 peer-reviewed research articles in a wide variety of academic and practitioner journals. He's a contributor to Forbes, Advisor Perspectives. He's an expert panelist on the Wall Street Journal. The list goes on, but Wade has a newest book, let's touch on that, called Retirement Planning Guidebook, Navigating the Important Decisions for Retirement Success. Wade, you're also the author of 3 other books in the Retirement Researcher Guide series. So with that introduction, Wade Pfau, thank you so much for joining me and welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Lauren. It's great to be here. And another note that's not necessarily right in the bio, but I'm a graduate of East High School in Des Moines, Iowa, right there where you're from. And I'm an Iowa Hawkeye as well. I did my undergraduate at the University of Iowa.
Oh, perfect. Yep. Just down the street from where we're at here.
That's right. And my brother went to Iowa State. So we're well represented in our household.
There you go. You have both schools covered. Well, you know, I've been aware of your research for quite some time, and I feel like I've really gotten to know you maybe going back to like 2015 or 16 was when I first started going through that RICP designation, that coursework, which stands for Retirement Income Certified Professional. And of course, the funny thing about it is, though, that's just a one-way relationship. So I'm curious if, you know, you have all these speaking engagements and things that you do. Do you have people come up to you and kind of already act like they know you, or is it a little bit of that vibe where sometimes like, oh, wait, there's Wade, but not realizing that it's only been a one-sided relationship up to that point?
Right. Yeah, that is something that does happen with the RICP program, just because it is pre-recorded content. But I'm people's professor, but right, it's not a live interactive class. So when I go to conferences, people do know me that I don't necessarily know them in advance, but it's always great to meet people in that context. And I've had a couple of experiences where I had an Uber driver once who recognized me, and I was once recognized in an airport bathroom by financial advisors. So within a very small community.
Sure.
Well, that one Uber driver, he was just doing that as a hobby. He's also a financial advisor.
Okay. Yeah, because we had the opportunity to meet in person just a handful of weeks ago in Kansas City. So yeah, it is a little funny that I meet you then, but I feel like I've known you for so long. And yeah, it was cool to have a lot of conversations with you. But I guess before we jump into some of the questions that I had planned about the RISA, you know, the retirement income stuff, you've written 4 books. For me, that feels like it would be, and your books are very detailed. You know, they're not just necessarily a grab it and skim through it really easily. There's a lot of detailed information there, which is, you know, to me, a compliment. So I guess the question is just, how do you go about that? Is that just how you're wired to write those? Or it feels like such a big undertaking for me to write a book.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a big undertaking. And really, the book I was always trying to write is the one you mentioned, the last of the 4 books, the Retirement Planning Guidebook. That's really the overview of everything related to retirement income. And then what happened is I was trying to write that book. These chapters got so long that they really could be spun off as their own independent books. So in the process of writing the Retirement Planning Guidebook, I wrote 3 books along the way. And then those 3 books are summarized within chapters in the retirement planning guidebook as well. So
Right.
it's a lot of content, but for someone who's just wanting to get started, it's not necessarily the case. They need all 4 books. The retirement planning guidebook is a good starting point. And that book, in a way, took me 10 years to write, not on an ongoing everyday I'm writing it basis, but when I could find time to work on it and so forth. And really during the pandemic, I had a good opportunity to really push towards getting it finished. And the first edition came out in September 2021, and I now try to update it every year.
Well, and you really dive deep into the research. So we'll get to that. Some of the research that you've found out maybe goes a little counterintuitive to industry standards, perhaps you could say. So perhaps a little teaser of what we'll cover in a little bit. But yeah, that's interesting. I always think of writing a book, and it's I had a conversation with Dr. Daniel Crosby over the summer, and he said he's written a few books, but only a couple that were good. The first one he wasn't as proud of, but he kind of jokingly said, yeah, it's pretty good. But do you look back on any of your other work and say, oh, I wish I would have done that a little different, or are you still pretty proud of what you put out there thus far?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. On the book side, I think I'm pretty happy with how things came out and wouldn't really have changed much. But certainly on the research side, it's kind of always learning new things. And so some of my older content, maybe I've subsequently revised quite a bit and may hold a different viewpoint now. But yeah, it's certainly always a learning process. And that's part of retirement income is my field. And it's a relatively new field in terms of just understanding how retirement's different from what comes before. So with it being a learning process, I guess one aspect there with the chapter I wrote on tax planning and how to do tax efficient retirement distributions and Roth conversions. It's like with every new edition of the book, I revise the method I use for explaining how to think about tax efficient retirement distributions. That'd be a good example where it's going through multiple iterations because it's an area that's not been figured out yet or solved. And so I think I get the answer, but then I gradually come to realize maybe there's something that works a little better than that. And so it's an iterative process.
And that makes sense too, I think, because, we talk about with clients having a living, breathing plan rather than a printout of their plan that, 50-page printout that we send them out the door with. And I think, retirement planning is the same way. So it makes sense that there would be a lot of future revisions to that.
Mm-hmm.
So jumping into your RISA technology. So you've created this technology called Retirement Income Style Awareness, shortened to RISA, RISA. So I guess just from a 10,000-foot view, can you explain what RISA is and why it's helpful?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and to just give a little context there as well, when I first entered into this sort of space on retirement income, you'd just see these huge arguments develop. And a lot of my early involvement was like there's this Bogleheads forum, online consumers talking about retirement topics and so forth. And then different like academics and people in the industry, Svi Bodhi and others, Jeremy Siegel, they have you can ask a basic question and get completely opposite answers about how to approach that. Like something like, is the 4% rule safe? Or is there any role for annuities? You get these completely different answers. And so initially I was thinking about, well, there are these 2 different schools of thought for retirement. And ultimately they're all viable, or they can be viable strategies, but people have different thinking processes about how do they evaluate or how do they pick a retirement strategy. And then that's where the RISA steps in. It's an assessment tool, a set of questions for individuals who may not even realize that there are these different retirement options out there. But even if they don't necessarily have to realize that, but to be able to sort through all that and figure out as a starting point for their own retirement, given all these huge debates and disagreements and discussions about the best way to approach retirement, well, the best approach for any individual is going to be something they're comfortable with so they can stick with it throughout retirement. Just the idea of the RISA, an assessment to help get people started in the right direction for building a retirement strategy that they're comfortable with and a strategy that is viable. And whether that means they go without any sort of income protections, or so it's a purely investment-based approach, maybe a high stock allocation, or whether they do want protections behind that. helping them identify an approach that really resonates and will be comfortable for them so that they can sleep at night and enjoy their retirement and have a plan that'll work for them.
So I think maybe what would be helpful, we'll go ahead and link in the show notes a sample that shows, maybe a condensed sample that shows there's 4 different primary quadrants, correct?
Right. Yep, the 4 different retirement styles.
So can you discuss a little bit between, we're trying to get down to what is your retirement style specifically to you? And if we're talking with a husband and a wife, of course, they're not always going to align, right?
Right.
So what we're really trying to do is not necessarily, pinpoint them exactly here. And that's, then it's just exactly, we know what to do. There's still some maneuvering there, but can you speak a little bit around the circle of what the 4 quadrants are?
And so the 4 quadrants or 4 styles, they were based on really an exhaustive research study of figuring out that there's these 2 factors that can really explain how people think about retirement. And it was really neat how they translate into these 4 styles. So there's total returns is one style, and that's often the default in the consumer media. Like as soon as people start reading about retirement, they'll probably come across the 4% rule. That's an example of total returns. It's you build a diversified investment portfolio that's fairly aggressive. The creator of the 4% rule said use 50 to 75% stocks in retirement. And then you just spend from that portfolio systematically throughout retirement. And it gives the characteristics of you're comfortable relying on the idea that the stock market will perform for you in retirement, and you want to maintain as much flexibility as possible for your plan. The other more natural alternative to that is income protection.
So before we jump into that one, can I stop you for a quick second?
Oh, sure.
I don't know if there's research out there on this one, but do you have any feeling or sense from doing some of the research that you have of like what percent of advisors kind of default into that total return as far as their kind of go-to strategy? Is that research out there?
Well, for the broader population, it does consistently look like about 1/3 of the population is comfortable with the total returns approach. But in the advisory world, there's a lot of different types of financial advisors. If you just start like going to Kiplinger or Money Magazine, or it doesn't exist anymore, but those kinds of outlets, usually the financial advisors being described there are investment managers. And in the investment manager world, you're going to find a very high percent or total returns, just because they believe in investments. And so they naturally gravitate towards what they're comfortable with, but then they view that as the best approach for everyone to use.
Right.
Pre-retirement, most people do tend to have more of an investment orientation. It's just a question of, do they make any changes to that post-retirement? And with an investment manager, with total returns, there's no need to make a change. This is what you're comfortable with. And yeah, I think a lot of advisors in that area would just advocate for that style.
Sure. So, and the 1/3 number you mentioned is not the number of advisors that use that strategy. That's how many customers or retirees would kind of gravitate towards that strategy.
Right. In terms of like purely understanding the breakdown of advisors, that's a difficult question, and we don't have an answer for it, because even just defining who is a financial advisor in the United States is complicated. And there's how many financial advisors are there in the US? Estimates range from 300,000 to over 1 million. It really depends on how that's being defined, whether there's any sort of professional credential or whether someone just calls himself an advisor and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's hard to get the numbers when the industry's having trouble even defining what an advisor is. So we have the total return quadrant or style. What would be the second one?
The other more common one is income protection. And the characteristics there are, you really prefer to have some sort of contractual protection for the assets that are covering your core essential spending in retirement. And you're more comfortable committing to a strategy that will solve your problem over a lifetime basis. And so the natural set of strategies there, it's called essential versus discretionary, or it's called the flooring approach. The idea is you first build a floor of protected lifetime income to cover your basics. And then on top of that, that's when you start investing. And that's for more discretionary types of goals, so that you might use that higher stock allocation, but you have some flexibility there. It's not the end of the world if the stock market goes down and you can't make all those expenses, but you're comfortable taking more of a growth orientation to enjoy a higher lifestyle, knowing that you've got your basics covered. And so that the floor includes Social Security and pensions and so forth. But that's where a conversation around annuities becomes more relevant if you have more essential expenses than you already have through Social Security or pensions.
Yeah, when was it? The early 80s. I think prior to that, people didn't really have to make a lot of these decisions because most retirement plans were more pension based, and
Right.
you just continued to receive a paycheck in retirement as if you never quit working in a lot of ways. And a lot of these decisions were not there to be had. So yeah, that makes sense that people might still gravitate towards that type of mentality, even though that option of a traditional pension might not be there.
Yeah, we had the traditional company defined benefit pensions that provided that protected lifetime income. And then through accident, the 401k idea was discovered in the tax code. And that led to a huge shift from traditional company pensions into 401k plans, where it's investment accounts, and people became responsible for saving, for picking investments, and then for deciding how much they can spend in a sustainable manner. And so the 401k world is a total return approach. And if you want to recreate that traditional defined benefit pension approach, the traditional company pension, well, income protection would be, okay, let's use an annuity as a replacement for that pension that we lost because our company switched from defined benefit to 401k defined contribution pensions.
Sure. So maybe I misspoke. Are there two separate, or are you still defining them in kind of the four different quadrants?
Oh, yeah. And well, those are the two more common. And then there's two other more hybrid types of styles. So there are four styles. There's also time segmentation, which more common, we call it that, but it's known as bucketing. It's this idea, it's more of an investment approach, but rather than using your total return investment portfolio, where you're talking about, okay, my portfolio is 60-40 stocks and bonds, I'm just investing, I'll just spend from that portfolio. The bucketing or time segmentation approach is looking at building different buckets for different expenses over time, so that you have these short-term buckets. That's where the bonds go to cover upcoming expenses. And then you have long-term buckets. That's where there's more of a growth orientation to earmark assets for longer-term expenses. And then you just need some sort of mechanism. When will I allocate from those growth buckets into the short-term spending buckets?
Sure. I've been listening to your own podcast. You guys have been talking about how to take this from philosophy to reality and how to actually implement some of these ideas. And sometimes it sounds like there's maybe a little bit more hands-on, or that goes into actually implementing a true bucket type strategy.
Yeah, that's right. It's bucketing. There's no clear definition about what it even means. And I say, like, if you ask 100 different financial advisors what bucketing is, you'll get 100 different answers. And a big part of that is, well, how do you allocate from your long-term buckets to your short-term buckets? A lot of the approaches haven't really put much thought into that, even though it's a really important part of the strategy. To make bucketing work effectively, it does require this idea that you want to potentially, if things are not going well, you get more aggressive. You're going to not reallocate from the growth bucket. And so you're going to have less bonds. You're going to increase your stock allocation and hope for kind of the Hail Mary pass that markets are going to recover in time.
Which can be a little bit challenging from a consumer behavioral standpoint, right? That can be a little challenging because you're asking people already probably feeling a little bit uncomfortable that, hey, not only do we need to stay the course, we may have to even lean into this a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Right. It does require some behavioral fortitude. But then advocates of bucketing would say, but actually just the idea of bucketing helps people to have that fortitude. They know, if I have like the next 8 years of expenses covered in bonds, and then there's a stock market downturn, I don't have to worry. I'm not going to panic. I'm not going to sell my stocks. I'm going to leave them alone. And I'm pretty hopeful that they will recover. before I have to actually sell from them. So I'll go ahead and my 8 years of expenses will become 7 years, and then 6 years as I'm spending it, 5 years. And by the time it gets down to zero, I feel comfortable that the stock market will recover, and then I can go ahead and then rebuild my short-term buckets. But if you're not comfortable with that idea, that's not the retirement income style for you.
Yeah, a lot of that is you're kind of just reframing it for the investor, right? Can be pretty darn helpful, because I think if you ask someone if the market's really been rocky and they're maybe feeling a little uneasy and saying, hey, maybe we should move some more to cash, I guess the question would be, well, this is our 8 years plus bucket. The market might not recover within the next 3 months, 6 months, or even a year, but do we think it will be recovered by 8 years? That's reframing it to a conversation where I think a lot of people would be comfortable with that versus seeing the day-to-day swings that the market can have.
It's really, if it works for you, it works for you because it resonates with, yes, I don't have to worry about short-term stock market volatility because I know I'm not going to be forced to sell that for X number of years.
Right.
For me, that doesn't resonate with me on a personal level, but other people, it does. And
Sure.
So you got to find the style that you're comfortable with.
Right. Which is the whole point of the styles, right? So we have total return, we have protected income, and then we have the time segmentation or the bucketing strategy. What goes into that fourth style?
The fourth one we call risk wrap. And that one is, so I'm more comfortable relying on markets. It's got this probability based, like total returns does, but then it also has this commitment. I'm willing to commit to a strategy. And so it's like, I am comfortable taking on the market risk with a total returns investing approach, but I don't want to be 100% dependent on that. I'd like to have some guardrails, some sort of protections, some sort of commitment to a strategy. And that's where we've seen this evolution since the 1990s of these different types of annuities that give you more ability to grow assets inside the annuity and also give you income protections. But those income protections, if the markets don't end up doing very well, those income protections would be lower than traditional fixed annuities. And you may, if you're risk wrap, if that's your style, you're willing to accept a lower guarantee for those worst case scenarios because you feel more confident that you'll be able to grow those assets and grow the amount of income that's guaranteed from that portfolio over time.
So the products and strategies in that quadrant would you say those have developed and improved over the years? Because I always remember some of that being a kind of challenging strategy to implement because it could get quite expensive if you're trying to cap your downside, but also I just never found a great way to do that potentially in the past. Does that improve with the strategies of today?
Well, yeah, I think maybe what you're alluding to there about variable annuities, traditionally, when someone says annuities have high fees, they're probably talking about these variable annuities with the various expenses. They could add up to more than 3%. So for that, there are now variable annuities with less expenses. There's fee-only annuities out there, and they have the income protection is usually 1 to 1.5%. And that's really just the cost of the insurance to provide those protections. But beyond that, there are variable annuities where the other expenses are kept pretty low, more comparable to other types of investments. Of course, there are high expense annuities out there as well. And then the other type of annuity we've seen that's just developed more recently, or at least become more popular over the last few years, is the registered index-linked annuity that it provides some downside risk, but in exchange for that, it has more upside potential than like a fixed index annuity that protects the underlying principal. But when interest rates were low a few years ago, could provide very little upside growth potential alongside that.
Say the name of that type of annuity again.
The registered index-linked annuity, they're called RILAs.
Okay.
Or, well, they all have a lot of names, structured annuities or buffered annuities or other names.
Yep, I may be more familiar with hearing buffered annuities, but our industry likes to have acronyms for just about everything, right? So that we can...
They do.
Yeah, sometimes I don't blame the consumer who ends up confused because there's a lot of acronyms out there.
That's right.
Has anything really surprised you from the data that's come in from people taking these RISA assessments up to this point?
In terms of surprises, actually, like one thing, going back to the earlier question about, is there anything I would have changed if I redone things? What we did learn from this, that the bucketing approach, I always viewed as more of a like probability-based style in terms of you have to be comfortable with market growth. But it turned out a lot of the characteristics were more safety first. So we actually classify bucketing as a safety first approach. So my two of my older books, they're kind of misnamed or miswritten. When you look at the matrix we created with the retirement income style awareness, the safety first approaches are time segmentation and income protection. The probability based approaches are total returns and risk wrap. But when I wrote two of my previous books, the book I called Safety First Retirement Planning, I had risk wrap as part of that instead of time segmentation.
Okay.
And then my book that was more about using investments for retirement income, I had time segmentation as part of that book instead of being in the safety first book. So I sort of intuitively got that wrong, at least when we could see, when people are answering all these different questions and you look at how their answers align to identify distinct groups of questions and that lead to distinct factors, it was a surprise to me to see that the bucketing approach was more safety first rather than being more probability based.
When you said that roughly 1/3 would fall into that probability category, were you at that point dividing it into two, or is that into four categories? Like, where would the other three categories fall?
That was in the four. So that it's income protection is usually the most popular, and it's more than 1/3, like 35 to 38% of people. Then you have total returns that usually is closer to around 33%.
Okay.
And then the rest are split between the time segmentation bucketing and the risk wrap. And depending on the study we've done, somewhere in the neighborhood of 15 to 17% for each of those two categories.
I also liked how the one of the questions that people go through are how involved they like to be with the process, whether they're a delegator or the what's the language that's on there, the
Collaborator, delegator, validator, and do-it-yourself or self-directed individual.
So that helps from the standpoint of how involved does someone want to be? You know, the old analogy of, do you want to look under the hood or just know that the car runs?
Right.
Do you want to know how the watch works, or do you just want to know what time it is? I think we see people all across the board. And if you try to skip over all the details with one person, they're going to say, well, why aren't they telling me everything? And the next person's going to say, why in the heck is this guy giving me all the details? I just want to know that we have a plan that works.
Right.
So I think that's really helpful too.
Yeah. That's separate from the retirement income style awareness. It's part of the same. It's another option, an add-on when you create the assessment, if you want to understand how people would like to implement the financial plan. And right, you can see the delegators are the ones who they may understand these topics, or they may not. They may feel like they don't have much confidence in doing their own financial planning, or they may feel like they could do it, but they just don't want to spend the time on it. They want to delegate that task or outsource that task to someone else. And then as an advisor that, okay, I don't have to get as deep into the weeds, because that's the case where they just want to know what time it is. They don't want to know how the watch was made. Whereas the collaborators, they do want to be much more engaged and involved in the process. And they want to really dig in deep, and they may have many questions, or they may share articles and things and ask about that. And that's where going into the weeds makes more sense. Those people are looking for that deeper dive. They feel more comfortable and interested in exploring these topics, but they do value the guidance of an advisor as part of that as well.
And a total do-it-yourselfer would maybe just be coming to an advisor to kind of get a thumbs up on their plan, make sure there's not any huge blind spots that they overlooked, potentially just pay a one-time planning fee, and then not have that ongoing relationship would be potentially maybe what more so they'd be looking for.
Yeah, even that's more a validator too, who doesn't have a lot of confidence to do things on their own, but doesn't necessarily have a lot of confidence that they do want to work with an advisor. And then a do-it-yourself individual may not even want to have a meeting, or they are more comfortable just doing things on their own. Or if there's some financial product that they're looking into, it might be more of that. Well, I just want this financial product. I don't want you to be my long-term advisor. That sort of cadence.
Right. Gotcha. I'm going to read one line that you have in your book. So you say in the book that the RISA profile provides a way for people to quickly understand if they are speaking the same language. And I love that line because figuring out if you're speaking the same language, people can often say the same sentence, but mean two very different things. So that really just resonated with me. I don't know if you have much to say specifically about that, but I just wanted to share that line of, it's a way for people to understand if they're speaking the same language. Yeah, that really hit home for me.
Yeah, and part of that too is just there could be some underlying just things that people have in mind that don't align. So I can make a statement that's factually correct, like historically in the United States, stocks have always outperformed bonds over reasonable holding periods. And that statement is true, but then where are two people speaking the same language? For one person, that statement may lead to, and that's why you should be 100% stocks and you're going to have a better outcome over the long term. Someone else can hear that statement, recognize it's true, but say, no, wait a second, I'm only going to get one opportunity for retirement, and stocks are risky. And even though in the historical data, they always did better, there's no guarantee they're going to do better in the future. And so
Right.
I can still believe that statement, but not necessarily want to make my entire retirement reliant on the continued truth of that statement.
Right.
And that's where it's just not the same language.
It reminds me of risk profiles. So there's, some mixed research on this too, but we try to identify a person's risk profile with a very specific number, have them answer pretty extensive questionnaire and ideally send it to them more than once. So you're not just catching them on one emotional day, or they're looking at the stock market and things are going well. So maybe they answer it favorably and say they can take on more risk. But the language of conservative, moderate, aggressive, that can obviously mean very different things to different people as well.
And you're right that with traditional risk tolerance questionnaires, they are dependent on what's been happening recently in the financial markets. If the stock market's been going up, you'll score as being more risk tolerant. If the stock market's been going down, you'll score as being less risk tolerant. You'll want that conservative approach, and that changes. Now, this has been interesting for us with the retirement income style awareness. As best as we can determine, your retirement income style will not fluctuate with the financial markets, unlike risk tolerance.
Right. Interesting. Yeah. And it's hard to have, a constant there. The amount of variables that can go into how people answer a risk questionnaire could be the stock market all the way down to how their day's going. So, we try to do the best with what we can there, but it is a little harder to pin down than the RISA profile that you guys have created.
Yeah. And with risk questionnaires, it's all hypothetical. It's like, are you comfortable with your portfolio going down 20%? Well, if I just answer that question and the market's been doing well, I might say, sure, that sounds okay.
Yeah.
But when it actually happens, and that's, people need the real test. So like 2022 was a good test of all this. The pandemic was a good test of that, or spring 2020, the financial crisis in 2008. That was when you really get to determine your risk tolerance, because if you could tell yourself, I need to stay the course, not panic, not sell my stocks, this will recover, I will be okay. If you were able to successfully do that, that means you have more risk tolerance. And if you panicked and sold all your stocks during these downturns, that's the true meaning that you did not, your risk tolerance is lower than you thought it was.
That's a good point. You can look backwards and see what someone actually did in real life. I think it's helpful also to, instead of, our minds don't work very well in terms of percentages. So if you said, are you comfortable with a 20% loss? Someone might say, yeah, that's not so bad. But let's say they have a $2 million portfolio and you say, what happens if your portfolio drops by $400,000, they say, woof, that's too much. But the 20% they are maybe okay with. So putting things into a dollar perspective, I think, is helpful there too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. The framing of that, it's really important. Yeah. Yeah. 400,000. Are you okay losing 20% or are you okay losing $400,000? Even if it's the same thing, it can just be perceived very differently for sure.
Right. A little side note, we just went to one of the local churches and voted on some topics here in the Waukee School District. And just the framing of questions on a voter ballot has such an impact. Framing is everything, really. Kind of in line with that, we touched on this a little bit earlier, but every advisor probably has their own RISA profile themselves, their personal profile, if they took the assessment themselves. So how can we ensure that we're not imparting our own style on our clients? I mean, I suppose that's the whole purpose of creating the technology, right? So that we're looking at it individually instead of just saying, I'm this style and I'm going to make everybody fit into that box with me.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an important question, because that also just speaks to not every financial advisor will be interested to use the RISA. If you're an advisor who thinks there is just one style that's best for everyone, you don't need the RISA, because you are trying to fit everyone you meet into that style.
Right.
It's the advisors who are more thoughtful and willing to respect the idea that no, people approach these kinds of questions differently. Then that's where the RISA becomes a tool that can be helpful to then help identify that starting point for each person, because you are willing to consider different approaches for different clients.
Right.
And if you just don't, even with everyone's going to have their own, this is the personal style that I'm most comfortable with, but that doesn't mean I have to impose that on everyone. And so the advisors who are more open to having some flexibility there and work with different individuals to find the style that's right for them, they'll have much more interest in the RISA than that's some of the pushback we get, because we hear from a lot of financial advisors. And I remember one classic quote, it was on, Alex and I wrote an article from Michael Kitcey's website. He's a popular writer for financial advisors about the RISA. And one reply was, isn't this unnecessary? Isn't the job of the advisor to convince every client to be 100% stocks? It's like, okay, well, there's your example. That person doesn't need the RISA. But advisors who are more open and flexible and recognizing that there are different approaches that are viable, and it's important to find the approach that someone's comfortable with.
Right.
They're going to resonate much better with the idea that the RISA can help with that process.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think particularly, not as just a rule of thumb, I think people generally become a little bit more conservative as they age. So probably for younger advisors, like, I guess I'd still throw myself in that category, even though I recently turned 40, but for advisors who are much younger than their clients, that's particularly important to make sure you're finding their style and not imparting your own, because maybe I'm making a generalization here, but being younger, you're probably more apt to be quite a bit more aggressive than a lot of your clientele.
Right. And just with economic theory, you should be, because a lot more of your wealth is stored in your future earnings. So
Sure.
your financial assets are less, and you can afford to invest more in a more risky manner at a younger age. It's very different when you have a paycheck to cover your expenses versus you don't have any paycheck and you have to live off what you've saved and accumulated. Those are two very different situations, and it is harder for younger advisors to recognize how this changes post-retirement.
Sure. So before jumping into kind of a different topic here, anything else on RISA that we hadn't covered that you'd like to touch on?
Well, I thank you for being one of our active users with the RISA, using with your own clients and so forth. So thank you for that. And, I think we covered the basic ideas. It's the starting point. You're not forced to go with the style that the RISA assessment tells you is your style, but at least you have a starting point for the conversation. And if you ultimately go a different route, you have the ability to make an informed decision about that. But we do find most people agree that the style identified was correct. It's the style that they do feel most comfortable with. And that's more from our community of do-it-yourself people that I tend to have more of an audience with, where they do recognize and understand there are different styles, and so they know which one was right for them, versus the typical American who may not have spent much time reading about retirement income topics. It may be harder for them to say, oh, this is the right style for me, because they don't really know what the alternatives were.
Right.
But yeah, we do find for people who can make this sort of evaluation, they think that the RISA is providing them with the right starting point. But you're not forced to stick with that. It really is just meant to be a starting point as you start thinking about the transition from pre-retirement into retirement. How should you approach building your retirement plan?
Yeah, I've been impressed with the conversations that it opens up with clients, and just the way that you can ask some questions that maybe you would not have thought to ask before, because trying to make a judgment, unless you have some sort of, I think we think about, oh, this client is kind of in that category, and then they take an assessment and maybe you find out that that wasn't quite as accurate as you thought it was. So it's really nice to have their own words there, and you're not trying to put words in their mouth of how they should be planning their own retirement.
Right. It's allowing the individual to speak for themselves in a manner that, if they're not deep into the world of retirement, they don't know the jargon or terminology, but this is helping them get through that whole mess,
right,
and speak for what they are most comfortable with.
Right. So we're going to put a link in the show notes. We may even put a link in there if you want to go ahead and take your own RISA assessment. We'll add that, but we'll put a sample in there so you can visually see. If you're a learner like me, more of a visual learner, hopefully that will be helpful. I try to do a cheat sheet, is what I call them, with most of my podcast episodes, just because we have so many people that are more visual or just want the bullet points. So we'll add that in the show notes. Hey everyone, Lauren here again to wrap up this episode. As I was just mentioning with Wade, we've gone ahead and decided to add a link in the show notes so that you can take the RISA assessment for yourself. If you are married, I would encourage your spouse to complete an assessment of their own. One of the advantages of the RISA is to understand how your spouse may have different thoughts on what retirement income should look like. Armed with this information ahead of time can help a lot when it comes to future conversations between the two of you, as you will have a basic understanding where each of you are coming from. So that will be in the show notes, and this link will just include half of the available questions, 24 in total. The full RISA assessment is 64 questions, which can get a bit long for some. So we've shortened it to still give you the bullet points of what you're looking for. And I know we talked about this with Wade, but I'm going to give you a quick recap of the different quadrants so that you know exactly what it is you'll be receiving after taking this assessment. The main purpose of RISA is to determine if you are more probability-based or more in the safety-first camp, and whether your characteristics are more optionality or commitment-based. Someone who is more probability-based is going to be more comfortable investing in the market and the swings that come with this. Someone who is more safety-first is going to prefer to know exactly where income is coming from without relying on market gains. Pivoting now to the next two characteristics, if you have an optionality personality, you are going to want a plan that is flexible, that you can make adjustments to. If you are more commitment-based, you are okay giving up some flexibility for that certainty that comes with contractual guarantees. So that leaves 4 combinations. And I know this can be difficult to follow along when it's audio only, so I encourage you to print off the PDF that accompanies each episode, as this is going to show you each of the 4 quadrants that I'm referring to. So getting back to the combinations, if you are more probability-based in combination with an optionality personality, this quadrant is referred to as total return, and you're going to be comfortable investing most or all of your portfolio in the market. While this quadrant provides the least amount of certainty, it provides the most upside to further grow a portfolio. Moving on to the next combination of probability-based, but with a commitment style, you're still going to prefer investing in the market, but you're going to appreciate some guardrails. We've referred to this as risk wrap. This approach strives to eliminate some of the outliers, both on the positive and negative return ends of the spectrum, which smooths out your returns a bit. Roughly 1/3 of retirees prefer one of these first two options on the probability side of the chart. The next two options describe safety-first approaches, which of course makes up the other 2/3 of retirees. This makes a lot of sense as people tend to shift more towards a safety-first approach once their working years are behind them. So first, let's look at safety first paired with a commitment-based personality. Now, this person is going to appreciate making fewer investment decisions in lieu of having contractually guaranteed income. This quadrant is referred to as protected income, and it's akin to the pension plans of old. And the last approach is the combination of safety first with an optionality style, which leads us to the quadrant we call time segmentation, also commonly referred to as a bucketing strategy. With this approach, you appreciate knowing where your next 5 or 10 years of income will come from, but you give up some of the guarantees to maintain that flexibility in your plan. So that's the primary component of RISA, and with your assessment link, we've also included a few short questions that will help you determine if you are more of a do-it-yourselfer or if you're a delegator. Another common outcome is that of a collaborator, in which you don't wish to manage things on your own, but you want to stay involved in the decision and thought process. This last part of the RISA assessment should help you understand if and where an advisor could help with your planning. Now, taking a step back and looking at this from the big picture, each of these 4 retirement income styles have different products and strategies that match up with the appropriate style. The goal is, first off, to help make you aware that different styles even exist, and secondly, to help your retirement plan best fit with your unique personality and needs, rather than having someone else impart their own beliefs into your strategy. If you've made it this far, I appreciate you for listening and sticking with us. This was a longer episode than normal, but I hope you found it well worth your time. In our next episode, we are going to wrap up the conversation with Wade with a couple of hotly discussed topics: annuities and reverse mortgages. I love talking with Wade about, well, really any topic, I guess, because he has a way of calmly setting aside emotion and discussing what the hard facts and research tells us. If you want to check out any of our past episodes, visit integrityguidance.com and click on the podcast tab. I hope you stick with us and come back for another episode in 2 weeks, and God bless.
Thank you so much for listening and supporting this podcast. If you've enjoyed listening, we would love if you took a quick moment to leave an honest review. Of course, we're shooting for 5 stars, but if you have suggestions to improve the show, we would love to hear from you too. Just click on the podcast name, Healthy, Wealthy, and Wise Retirement Podcast, and scroll down to ratings and review. Thanks again for your support, as this helps us reach a wider audience and help even more retirees just like you. This podcast is for entertainment and informational purposes only and is not intended as a specific tax, legal, or investment advice. Lauren Sherman is a certified financial planner and co-owner of Integrity Wealth Management, an investment advisor serving retirees in search of their own healthy, wealthy, and wise retirement lifestyle.